Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are asking one of the most fundamental questions in all of science. Why is life exactly where it is?
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about, giant predators or these huge dominant trees. We're asking about organisms like the tiny 8 millimeter pedipharine swiftorm frog.
One of the smallest vertebrates on Earth.
Exactly. And it's only found in this one tiny specific spot in Papua New Guinea. So what invisible forces are drawing the boundaries of its world?
It is the ultimate geographic mystery, really.
Mm.
And to solve it, we have to look at the entire engine that runs life on this planet.
And that engine is ecology.
Exactly. Ecology.
Now, I think a lot of people hear ecology and immediately think, environmentalism.
They do. It's a common mix-up.
But it's so much broader. It's the scientific study of the interactions between organisms and their environment.
Right. And that environment includes everything.
Yeah.
The living parts, the other organisms, we call those biotic factors, and the physical world, the non-living abiotic factors.
The key thing here, I think, is the incredible scale.
Oh, absolutely. We can start super small, looking at organismal ecology. So how does one individual flamingo, say, adapt to its environment or choose a mate?
Okay, and then you zoom out. You get a whole flock of flamingos,
Yeah.
and now you're studying population ecology.
Right. What affects their size?
Yeah.
How does that population change over time? Then zoom out again, and you're looking at how different species interact.
Predators, competitors.
All of it. And that's community ecology.
So from there, you bring in the physical world, the soil, the water, the sun.
And you start analyzing how energy flows and chemicals cycle between the living and the non-living. Now you're in ecosystem ecology.
And no ecosystem is an island, right?
Not at all. So the next step is landscape ecology, where we study how energy and organisms move across connected ecosystems. Think of like the edge between a forest and a grassland.
And finally, the biggest picture of all.
Global ecology. Yeah. We're looking at the entire biosphere, the sum of everything, and how these huge regional exchanges, things like ocean currents and air circulation.
How they influence life across the whole planet.
That's our map for today. We're starting big, globally, and then we're going to drill right down into the details.
And if we're starting globally, we have to start with the biggest determinant of where something can live. And it's not biology, really. It's physics. It's climate.
Exactly. Climate is driven by four key physical factors: temperature, precipitation, sunlight, and wind. And the whole system, it really kicks off with the sun.
Okay, let's unpack this engine. It all starts because the Earth is, well, it's a sphere. It's curved.
Right. Think about it like a flashlight. If you shine it directly at a wall, you get a bright, focused circle of light.
But if you shine it at an angle, that same amount of light is spread out over a much bigger, weaker area.
And that's the core of latitudinal variation. Sunlight hits the tropics, that band around the equator, most directly. So it gets the maximum heat and light per unit area.
And as you move towards the poles, the angle gets more and more oblique, spreading the energy out. That's why it's colder.
And that intense heat in the tropics, it creates these massive, predictable weather patterns. And this is really cool because this one dynamic explains why the world's deserts are where they are.
So how does that work?
It's all about global air circulation. The intense sun near the equator heats the air, making it rise. And this is warm, wet air.
Okay, so this big column of humid air is rising. What happens next?
Well, as it rises, it expands and cools.
Yeah.
And because cool air can't hold as much moisture, it dumps it.
Right, creating massive rainfall.
The tropical rainforest, exactly.
Yeah.
So now this air mass is high up, it's cold, and it's essentially dry.
It's all rained out. So where does that dry air go?
It travels toward the poles until it starts to sink back to Earth, usually around 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude.
And as it descends?
It gets compressed, it warms up, and critically, this warm, dry air starts sucking moisture out of the land below it.
And that's what creates the world's major deserts.
That's it. The Saharas, the Australian outback, they're just the exhaust from the tropical rain machine landing predictably at 30 degrees. It's a fantastic mental map.
It really is. And this cycle continues with air rising and raining again around 60 degrees latitude.
And on top of all that, you have wind. These huge air movements are deflected by the Earth's rotation, giving us things like the cooling trade winds in the tropics and the prevailing westerlies in temperate zones.
So global patterns give us the big outline. But when we zoom in, regional and local factors start to paint in the details. And you said the first one is seasonality.
Right. We all experience seasons, but the key driver isn't how close we are to the sun. It's that Earth is tilted on its axis about 23.5 degrees.
And that tilt does more than just change the temperature,
Oh,
right?
it has massive consequences.
Mm.
I mean, beyond day lengths and solar radiation, one of the most fascinating is in the ocean. The seasonal shift in wind patterns can cause something called upwelling,
Upwelling, that's where cold, deep water rises to the surface. Why is that such a big deal?
because that deep water is packed with nutrients. It's basically the decomposed remains of organisms that sank years ago. When upwelling brings those nutrients to the surface.
It's like fertilizer for the ocean.
It is. It fuels huge blooms of phytoplankton, which form the base of massive food webs. These small upwelling zones are responsible for over 25% of the world's entire fish catch.
Wow, so seasonal wind shifts are directly tied to the global economy. That's a huge connection.
It's massive. And another major regional factor is just having large bodies of water nearby. The Gulf Stream, for example, carries warm water up to Europe, giving London a much milder winter than, say, parts of Canada at the same latitude.
And water acts as a temperature buffer, too.
Right, because it has a high specific heat. It resists changing temperature. In summer, the land heats up way faster than the ocean, so the warm air over land rises, and it pulls in that cool air from over the water.
The classic sea breeze.
That's it. The water is like a giant thermostat.
Okay, what about topography? Mountains are like literal climate makers. They create the famous rain shadow effect.
They do. So if warm, moist air blows in from the ocean and hits a mountain range, it's forced to go up.
And as it rises, it cools and dumps all its moisture.
Right, on the side facing the windward side,
Yeah.
you get lush forest there. But by the time that air gets over the peak and starts descending the other side, the leeward side, it's completely dry,
And it starts absorbing moisture from the land.
creating a desert. The Mojave Desert east of the Sierra Nevada is a perfect example.
And mountains also affect temperature, right? Something like a 6-degree drop for every 1,000 meters you go up.
Exactly, about 6 degrees Celsius, which is why you can find polar-like communities on high mountains right near the equator.
So if mountains affect climate, life itself does too. We think of forests as being dark, so they should absorb more heat.
And they do, but that warning is more than offset by transpiration.
That's the evaporative water loss from all the leaves.
Millions of leaves. It acts like a giant natural air conditioner, cooling the forest surface and pumping humidity and precipitation into the region.
So large-scale deforestation would make a region hotter and drier.
Significantly hotter and drier. Yeah, we see that happen.
And we can go even smaller down to the microclimate, like
Wrong.
the difference between standing in the direct sun and moving into the shadow of a rock.
Or a salamander staying cool and damp under a fallen log, buffered from the extremes. All of these scales, global, regional, local, micro, are now being fundamentally changed by global climate change.
And this isn't just a small variation. It's a sustained, directional change over decades, driven by greenhouse gases. The scary part is the speed.
The pace is terrifying. Take the American beech tree. To keep up with warming, models show its range needs to shift northward by maybe 700 to 900 kilometers this century.
That's what, 7 to 9 kilometers a year?
Per year. Now compare that to how fast it moved after the last ice age. About 0.2 kilometers per year.
That's a huge mismatch. The trees just can't move fast enough.
They can't. And we're already seeing this stress in species, like certain bumblebees. They're retreating from the hot southern parts of their range, but they aren't colonizing the cooler northern areas fast enough to keep up.
So, climate sets the stage. And the result is these major life zones we call biomes. They're mostly characterized by their vegetation because the plants are the anchors.
Right. And to organize these, ecologists use a great tool called a climograph. It's just a simple plot of a region's average annual temperature against its average annual precipitation.
And when you look at one, what's the big takeaway?
It's not just about the average numbers, it's that the pattern of variation is just as important. When does it rain? How hot do the summers get?
So you could have two different biomes with similar rainfall.
Like a temperate broadleaf forest and a northern coniferous forest. They might get similar precipitation, but their wildly different temperature ranges support completely different life.
Biomes also have like an architecture to them, a structure.
Yeah, vertical layering. Especially in forests, you have the canopy, then a low tree layer, a shrub understory, the ground layer, the forest floor, and then the whole root system.
All creating different niches and habitats.
Exactly. And of course, you have the transition zones, the ecotones, where two biomes blend together. They're often very diverse.
And sometimes those biomes can be visually tricky. You mentioned how unrelated species can end up looking almost identical.
That's convergent evolution. The classic example is cacti in the Americas and euphorbs in Africa.
They look like cousins, but they're not.
Not at all. They're separated by millions of years of evolution, but because they both adapted to the same hot, dry desert pressures, they independently evolved those same water-storing spiny bodies.
That's fascinating, and it's important to remember that biomes aren't static. They're constantly being shaped by disturbance storms, human activity, and especially fire.
And sometimes disturbance is actually essential. In places like a savanna or chaparral, you need periodic fire to maintain the ecosystem.
Oh.
Well, it prevents one species from taking over. If you suppressed all fire, fire-adapted species like the longleaf pine would get shaded out by broadleaf trees, and the whole ecosystem would change.
Let's ground this with a few key examples. So, the tropical forest.
Highest diversity on Earth, defined by constant high temperatures and this intense competition for sunlight up in that dense canopy,
Then you have the desert.
defined by what it lacks: water. Less than 30 centimeters of rain a year. So the plants have all these incredible adaptations, spines, reduced leaves, special kinds of photosynthesis to survive the heat and conserve every drop.
And finally, the tundra. It covers something like 20% of the land surface.
It does. And its defining feature is permafrost, that permanently frozen soil layer. It stops roots from going deep, so you mostly get low-growing things like herbaceous plants, mosses, and grasses.
Okay, so that's land. Now let's dive into the aquatic biomes.
Right. And unlike terrestrial biomes, which are defined by plants, aquatic biomes are defined by their physical and chemical environment, mainly salinity.
Marine biomes have about 3% salt, and they cover, 75% of the Earth?
Roughly three-quarters of the planet, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're stratified vertically, kind of like floors in a building. The top layer, with enough light for photosynthesis, is the photic zone.
And below that is the aphotic zone, where it's dark.
Exactly. Together, all that open water is the pelagic zone. And then at the very bottom, you have the benthic zone, the seafloor or lake bed.
And the critters that live down there, the benthos, are mostly eating the stuff that sinks from above.
That's right, a constant rain of dead organic matter we call detritus.
Temperature creates layers too, right? The thermocline.
Yeah, that's a sharp change in temperature between the warm surface water and the cold, deep water. And in temperate lakes, this layering gets broken up twice a year in a vital process called turnover.
Can you walk us through that? It sounds really important.
It's critical. In the spring and fall, the surface water cools, or warms, to match the temperature of the bottom water. The thermocline disappears.
So the whole lake is one temperature.
Uniformly dense, yeah. So now the wind can mix the whole column of water. This is huge because it sends oxygen from the surface down to the deep, and it brings all those nutrients from the bottom back up to the surface.
Fueling a new bloom of life. Without turnover, the lake would stagnate.
Completely.
And with lakes, we also talk about them based on nutrients. Oligotrophic lakes are nutrient poor.
Right, they're often deep, clear, and oxygen-rich. Eutrophic lakes are the opposite, nutrient-rich, often shallower, and they can run out of oxygen in their deep areas.
And that's often made worse by human runoff, causing those big algal blooms.
Like a huge problem, yeah.
Another really productive area is the estuary.
That's a transition zone where a river meets the sea. Salinity there changes constantly with the tides, but because of all the nutrients coming down the river, they are one of the most productive biomes on the planet. Critical nurseries for fish.
And finally, way down deep in the marine benthic zone. It's mostly dark and cold, but there are these exceptions, these hydrothermal vents.
Incredible places. There are cracks in the seafloor spewing superheated, chemical-rich water. There's no sunlight, so the base of the food web isn't photosynthesis.
It's chemosynthesis.
Exactly. Chemototrophic prokaryotes bacteria that use chemicals like hydrogen sulfide for energy, they form the foundation for this entire, unique ecosystem living in total darkness.
So we've defined the potential environments, but a species isn't everywhere it could live. There are filters.
Ecologists use a kind of flowchart here, and the first question is always, can the species even get there? That's dispersal.
And the classic example of this is the cattle egret.
It's a perfect accidental experiment. Until the late 1800s, this bird was only in Africa and Europe.
Yeah.
Then somehow it made it across the Atlantic to South America.
It took off.
It exploded, it spread across South and North America, proving that this whole hemisphere was suitable habitat. It was only ever limited by the fact that it couldn't get here.
And when a species does successfully disperse to a new place, like an island, you can get things like adaptive radiation.
Like the Hawaiian silver swords, where one ancestral plant evolved into dozens of different species to fill all the new niches.
Okay, so if a species can get there, the next filter is biotic factors. Interactions with other species.
Right. Is there a predator, a competitor, a grazer keeping it in check? There was a great experiment with the long-spined sea urchin, Centrostephanus rogursi, that showed this perfectly.
What did they do?
Researchers found areas where these urchins were common. They then manually removed all the urchins from some plots, but left them in others as a control.
And the result?
In the plots where the urchins were removed, the seaweed cover just checked 8. It increased dramatically.
A super clean result. The urchin as a grazer was the biotic factor limiting the seaweed's distribution.
Exactly. So the final filter brings us back to the environment. Abiotic factors. And temperature is a huge one.
Like the giant saguaro cactus, it can't go too far north because it dies if it freezes.
If it gets below about -4 degrees Celsius for too long, it's done.
And we can bring that sea urchin back in here too. Water temperatures off Tasmania have risen.
By just 1 degree Celsius since 1950. But that 1 degree was enough to push the water over the 12-degree threshold the urchin larvae need to develop.
And so the urchin moved south.
It expanded its range, and now it's mowing down the local kelp forests. It's a perfect, real-time example of climate change causing a destructive species to shift its range.
And of course, water itself is a key factor. Too little is a problem, but too much can be too.
Right, in flooded soils, there's very little oxygen.
Yeah.
That forces adaptations, like the specialized roots of mangroves that stick up out of the water to breathe.
Then you have things like salinity, which is all about osmoregulation and sunlight. Too little light stops photosynthesis, but too much UV radiation can define the tree line high up on mountains.
Right.
Okay, so the ultimate synthesis here is that ecology and evolution aren't two separate subjects. They're locked in this constant feedback loop.
What we call reciprocal effects. We see the long-term effects. The evolution of plants massively changed the whole planet's carbon cycle.
And that new ecological landscape then created new pressures, leading to more evolution in animals and insects.
But the really mind-blowing thing is that this feedback happens fast. We can actually watch evolution changing ecology in just a few years.
And the proof is the Trinidadian guppy experiment.
A brilliant study. Researchers looked at guppy populations that evolved under high predation versus low predation, and they found they quickly evolved different food preferences.
And how did that change the ecosystem?
Well, the guppies from the low predation streams evolved to eat mostly algae. And because they were so good at it, they kept the amount of algae in their part of the stream really low.
Okay, and the high predation guppies.
They evolved to eat invertebrates. And those invertebrates were the main things eating the algae. So by eating the invertebrate grazers, these guppies actually caused the amount of algae to increase.
Wow. So a rapid evolutionary change in the guppy's diet completely restructured the plant community.
In just a short time, the guppy changes. And that change immediately alters the environment it lives in. Ecology is evolution in action. And evolution is ecology in motion. It's a dynamic cycle.
It's amazing. We've gone from the global physics of solar input all the way down to a sea urchin limiting a seaweed bed. The distribution of every single species, including that tiny frog in Papua New Guinea, is the result of all these factors interacting over time.
And as we've seen, those distributions are never static. They're governed by history, by ongoing pressures. And the critical challenge for us now is that the pace of human-driven change is just. It's outpacing the ability of so many species to disperse or adapt.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, built on this idea of eco-evolutionary feedback. We know that commercial fishing tends to target the oldest, largest cod. This practice has created a selection pressure that favors cod that reproduce when they're younger and smaller. So given that these younger, smaller fish have fewer offspring, how might this rapid, human-driven evolution affect the cod population's ability to ever recover from overfishing? And what other reciprocal ecological changes might that trigger in the wider ocean food web?
A question that links our actions directly to the evolutionary fate of an entire species. Thank you for diving deep with us today.